Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Gnostic Media's UnSpun, episode number 104. I'm your host, Jan Irvin. I'm joined today by our lovely guest, Holly Seeliger. We have a great and fantastic show lined up for tonight. We've done a lot of research and planning and preparing for this episode. There's a lot into this. So we have a lot to go through as well. This is a lot of original research that Holly has primarily done, and I've helped her with, and we're going to get into a little story before we dig in. But what I also wanted to do is thank everyone for the donations last week for the show and everything, and this week. I also wanted to thank Mark Devlin for sending me a copy of his new book, and apparently he cites me in it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm supposedly in it. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Wow. Where to begin? We've got so much ground to cover. Holly, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's just dig in. So we might as well start off with where things sort of began. The audience may be wondering how you and I met. Several weeks ago, you had published a video that sort of attacked me a little bit, and I had reached out to you, and we started discussing research. And so, anyway, I'll let you take over from there. Why don't you?
I have been producing videos on my YouTube channel for the past year and a half, doing commentary, research, and whatnot. And I put out a video about every day. And I decided for my New Year's Eve special, I was doing a research project called the CIA and the Culture Creators. And I was connecting a bunch of articles that I've seen recently about Hollywood film directors, etc., talking about how they utilize the military to create their storylines. They basically are promoting the war effort through film. And then I wanted to connect that to other instances in the United States pop culture where it seemed like the CIA or other shadow organizations, whatever you want to call them, are directly involved with creating the culture in the United States. And yes, I did reference your work. And I insulted you, and I think because I had a hard time connecting the whole story. Like, there was a part of me that's still like, they couldn't have created everything. Like, not everyone is a CIA agent, So the very next day, you had seen my video, and I noticed that you had commented on there, and you're like, you need to start reading my work and actually doing the research and following up on my work. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take you seriously because you've been doing this for more than a decade, right? So you sent me, I think it was Entheogens.
What's in a name? Yeah.
Yep. And then you sent me, you were like, you really need to read Spies in Academic Clothing before you, respond about my work. So I was like, okay, well, I should actually do that. And I printed out a copy of it, and I started to actually read it. And then I had my own ideas about what I saw as patterns recognized between Harvard and your research and research that I've done in the past.
And so that sort of brings us up to how we got onto Salem. So you had finished reading my article, and you had reached out to me with a bunch of your research on Salem. And you had done research, you had been doing research on Salem for years and just sort of following it.
Yeah.
And so because of my Spies in Academic Clothing article, you had sent me what you had, and we also had plugged the research into the database. And so I thought over your data for about a day and a half, and I came back to you with a solution for what was behind the and this is where it gets really good. What was behind the Salem Witch Trials? And then you, Holly, you really just took off and you dug in and you did some amazing research. So that sort of gets everybody up to speed here on how we got here and what we're doing today. And
yeah.
So now what we're going to do is we've put together basically a presentation. We've gone back and forth and reviewed all of this information and checked it out. So where do we dig in? So we, in my Spies in Academic Clothing article, I lay out the importance of academic cells and how these cells cross-site each other and create a web of academic intelligentsia, so to speak, that creates a web of control of the information that the population gets and how they digest it. That's probably an oversimplification for an 80-some page article, but so what I expose in there is how this whole function works inside the intelligence community, and I use the 7 main books for MK Ultra, that were published on MK Ultra as examples, like Marty Lee's Acid Dreams, Hank Albarelli's A Terrible Mistake, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John D. Marks, Operation Mind Control by Walter Boart, and several other books. But I use the 7 leading books, and I use them to show how the CIA was controlling the entire dialogue about MK Ultra by publishing its own books to control the official narrative. And so, this pattern you saw with Salem. So, all right, so now that kind of lays that out. So let's get into the general or official history of Salem and what everyone's been told about it.
Okay, so I have been researching Salem, Massachusetts, and the Salem Witch Trials for a long time. When I was in high school, I did my capstone project on the Salem Witch Trials, and I've always thought that the official story was lacking. It was bizarre, Basically, we're told that it's spontaneous mass hysteria. These girls just went crazy in puritanical Salem, and the end result is that 25 people died in the 1690s. And the whole story seemed bizarre to me. And as I was reading your research, I noticed the connection between Harvard and what you've talked about with Spies in Academic Clothing and the influence of Harvard in the Salem area. They're very close to each other. They're in Massachusetts. And my focus when I was in high school was Cotton Mather. And he was a pamphleteer. He was a medical professional and a graduate from Harvard. And it seemed like his fingers were all over the Salem Witch Trials, and I never could really make the connection to what was going on.
All right, so when you had sent me the research, now, do we want to just go through down the outline, or should we just let the audience know what we discovered now? I think we should hold off and keep their suspense up. And thanks for the donations coming in right now from the audience. I really appreciate that. Mick Clates and Anthony, who just donated $120 total between the two of you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So let's talk about the Mayflower Compact or contract, and what was that? That was in 1620, correct?
Yes. So the Puritans came over to Massachusetts. We're told that the beginning of America started with the Mayflower ship, with the Puritans on the ship sailing over 1620. They land at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, and they start something called the Mayflower Compact. And it's a new covenant between the Puritan people and the land mass of North America. And they talk about how, similar to the Old Testament, it's a covenant between the people and the land, similar to the Israelites. And so it was their, divine right to the land and to creation of the colony of Massachusetts.
All right. So now the colony of Massachusetts at Salem and surrounding area, they were a group known as Puritans. Now, we should explain a little bit about Puritans. Now, the Puritans are usually considered a Christian group, and that they were the ones who caused the Salem Witch Trials and caused all of these deaths and everything. Now, that is actually not at all true. Now, first off, the Puritans only follow the Old Testament, not the New Testament. Now, anybody who's familiar with Christianity knows right away that a Christian is someone who follows the New Testament and the Gospels, because that's where Jesus is discussed, and that's what makes a Christian. So if you don't follow the New Testament, you cannot be a Christian. So right off the bat, we have our first major red flag here, and which clearly identifies that the Christians have been blamed now for 326 years for something that they had no part of. Now, the Puritans were essentially a Jewish faction that followed the Old Testament, and we're going to get into more of them in just a minute here. But so the Puritans were known as... It was a new type of church that was basically called Congregationalism, that was decentralized. They didn't have a central church, which was actually antithetical to what the Bible says about having one unified church. And so the Puritan Congregationalism, it's very similar to Calvinism. And in fact, Calvinism was also a Jewish version of so-called Christianity, and this is a book from the 15th century, the Judaizing Calvin, that goes into just this, and how Calvin was not actually a Christian, how he was inverting everything. So this Congregationalism was at the core, and Puritanism was at the core of what took place at Salem. So, what we're going to do now is show how Christianity has been falsely blamed, and we're going to uncover the real history of this whole thing. What was the real culprit? What made the people go crazy and whatnot? And we're going to give the real story for the first time in 326 years. So, and one thing I do want to mention is that, the so-called scholars up to now who have published on this, we see the exact same sort of, just like I wrote in Spies and Academic Clothing regarding MKUltra, we see the exact same sort of cover-up going on with the Salem books. And just about every single year a new book on Salem comes out. There's thousands of books and pamphlets and all of this stuff out there, and they all tell the same nonsense. They all regurgitate the same official myth, and the Christians are at fault, people went crazy, etc. So, all right, so let's go into Jerusalem.
Okay, so another facet of Puritanism is that they wanted a church modeled after what they were calling ancient Christianity, and they were also embracing Enlightenment science, which was they wanted to separate themselves from what they perceived as like the old Catholic ways of Europe, and so they were embracing of what was a new study called science. So they founded the New Jerusalem, which was Salem, and Cotton Mather, who was a graduate of Harvard. His father was the first president of Harvard College when it was established. Harvard was founded by the Puritans, and Mather spoke about...
In what year was it founded?
Let's see. Harvard was founded in 1636, and Salem was founded in 1626.
So just a decade before by the same group of people.
Correct. So Salem was founded, and Cotton Mather and other Puritans at the time said that, because of the Mayflower Compact, it was a covenant with the land, and Salem was their new Jerusalem.
Right. So now, in the official version of history, what we're given is that, the Puritans were so strict. This Puritan Christianity, as this nonsense we're told, is, the women rebelled against the constraints of Puritanism, right? Was that really the case?
Yeah, there's books coming out like every single year. I think there's a new book. I don't remember the name of it, but
the feminists just love to rally behind this, right?
Yeah, it's this idea. It's like, okay, well, these women were constrained under the yoke of the Puritan religion, and this is how they rebelled, was through this mass hysteria. Their convulsions, their rebellion, accusations. Was for them to get attention, and we still use that term, puritanical, as in, restrained, or, versus like
a tyrant or something, right?
Right. So this has always been the official narrative, where they're like, we don't really know why these women, went crazy, these girls, and some of them were a little bit older, why they started up these accusations. It's called mass hysteria, is what basically they always say it comes down to.
Let's not give too much away yet.
Okay.
So, all right. So, Increase Mather is the first president of Harvard, and he is a Puritan. Now, again, the Puritans were not Christians. The Christians have been falsely blamed for this. The Puritans only believed in the Old Testament. You can look this up. It's well documented. They were not Christians. So, now, he is the first president of Harvard, and then his son comes along. And his son is a guy by the name of Cotton Mather. I like to call him Cotton Balls Mather. And he's basically the Salem Justice. And what was his position at Harvard?
So he was a graduate of Harvard. And back then at Harvard, it was kind of, it was not the same structure that we have today with colleges. He was doing medical research there. He was a minister. So when you graduated from Harvard, a lot of times people would become ministers. He was a prolific pamphleteer. He published thousands of letters and articles, and he owned the largest private book collection in North America, with over 3,000 volumes at the time. So
wow.
He was a real mover and shaker of Massachusetts and of the American colonies at that time.
I guess it pays off when your daddy is the first president of Harvard, right? Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, like, lucky him. So now, Cotton Mather, now a key connection that we're going to get into now. We're going to get into some of the details of what we really discovered behind this. Now, Cotton Mather, he was a member of the Royal Society. And the Royal Society is going to become a key factor in this entire investigation. Cotton Mather was also one of the key figures behind the theory of heliocentrism, and that also becomes a recurrent theme. And so, are we ready to give it out yet?
I suppose so. I mean, you've kind of said it with a little bit, so go for it.
Well, all right. So what we discovered, and you know what, I should also mention that somebody else, I think, had mentioned this to me about 6 months ago, or maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And so, April was on the show talking about, and here we go, vaccines back in, last year. And she had hinted that she had heard something maybe tied around this. But when I had looked at all of the data that Holly had provided me, one thing that really jumped out and stood out was vaccines and inoculations. So now a lot of people may be shocked to discover that vaccines and inoculation is not a new theory. It didn't come out in the in the 1930s or something like that. It's actually came. Do you know when vaccines, the idea of inoculation, first came about?
Well, so it started off with something they originally called it ingrafting, and it had to do with like them taking the juice from like a pustule of smallpox and just experimenting with that, putting that into a lanced arm and seeing what would happen. Then they would call it inoculation. And then it wasn't until the 1700s that they called it vaccines after like cowpox. So after like vache, which is the word for cow in French. So then it became vaccines. But during this time, inoculation was being experimented and promoted through the Royal Society.
All right. So, so what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially, no joke, some of the very first vaccine type trials going on out of Harvard University. And Harvard created let's just call it a large cover-up to cover up the whole story. And we're going to get into exactly how they did that. But so now, as a Puritan minister, Cotton Mather had described Puritanism, and this is going to get back to, Puritanism being Judaism and not Christianity. So as a Puritan minister, Cotton Mather described Puritanism in America as a Jewish exodus and the Native Americans as the Canaanites who are to be wiped out for the new Jerusalem. Okay, so that is quoting Cotton Mather, son of the president of Harvard, who is running no less than the very first vaccine or inoculation trials and experiments in the United States or in the colonies at the time.
So, serendipitously, or whatever, on the side, during that time, the native people in Massachusetts and what is now Maine were wiped out by plagues during that time. So they're saying about 90% of the Abenaki and Penobscot tribes in New England were wiped out because of plagues. And the Puritans thought that this, was somewhat appropriate, because then they could be taking over the land at that time. So there were many plagues during that era, and it had come over, from Europe. And then as it came into the United States, it was a common occurrence, both measles, smallpox, and they called it other bubonic based plagues. We don't really know all the different plagues that hit North America during that time.
So now, I'm showing the brain database up on the screen. I'm showing the Royal Society there. So a lot of these people are going to come into play in this whole thing. Now, the Royal Society, looking at all of this, what we've really found, and Jacob Duleman has been researching them a lot. We've discussed them a lot in recent weeks. But the Royal Society, what we've discovered is really the modern nexus of intel and of this disinformation. And their work primarily surrounds two things that we'll be discussing. One, which is the plague, the Black Plague, etc., and different plagues, and another one being Ergot. And so the Royal Society has centered much of their research around this stuff for centuries. Now, let's get into this guy, John Wilkins. And do you want to talk about him first?
You start with that.
All right. So John Wilkins, let me pull the brain database back up here. So he's one of the original founders of the Royal Society, and he was a member of the Invisible College. And the Invisible College was founded by a guy by the name of Robert Boyle. And, it was tied into Rosicrucianism, and it was also sponsored by King Charles II of England. So this Invisible College, it becomes key for all of this stuff, as well as the Royal Society, because it becomes part of the official narrative. But John Wilkins is one of the key people who also, interestingly, is behind heliocentrism, and he is also one of the key people behind the peer review system, which the peer review system is essentially a system of control so that the quote-unquote scientific community can keep out any dissenting views like the research in this show, so that they can, promote the official, horse crap version of the Salem story for 326 years. That's what peer review is. And so, this guy, John Wilkins, he's behind another group, which is this Gresham College group, and Gresham College, which is founded in 1645. And so we begin to see a link up of some of the key people with this Christian college now, this Gresham College now, Christopher Wren, all of these guys, Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, they're all key to this. Let me see, there was somewhere, some of these guys connect back into the, and I'll get there in just a minute, to the city of London. I'm forgetting who goes where here. Maybe it was Robert Hooke. But it connects right into the city of, yep.
Yeah.
Well, and it connects right into the city of London. I was just showing the database up there, here, I'll just pull it up here. City of London would be a faster way to find it, so here we go. All right, so it was Robert Hooke, and so the City of London Corporation is tied to this Gresham College, and they also create the Royal Exchange. But these guys are all tied with the City of London and with the Gresham College group, and then that goes in and that creates the Royal Society under King Charles in 1662.
Yep. So they received their first charter, their royal charter, in 1662, and basically they pretty much, as soon as they started to put together the first scientific journal, and that way they could institute peer review and publish each other's works and reference each other's works. And as the New World was founded, a lot of those same movers and shakers made their way over to the United States and founded Harvard College and continued this sort of creation of academia. And if you look into the Royal Society, it's still an organization that exists to this day, very powerful. You can take a look at their website. I mean, they've got their fingers in everything, and we have all the famous scientists and celebrities of today and of the 19th and 18th century were all members of the Royal Society, including founders of the United States, Ben Franklin, and then you mentioned the Huxleys and Darwin. And then in the 20th century, Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, all the people who are promoting this idea of scientism and however facet you want is coming through the Royal Society and peer review.
All right, so let's go into this guy, Robert Hooke. What can you tell us about him?
Okay, so Robert Hooke was one of the founding members of the Royal Society, English, and he was studying the plague flea. So in London, there was the bubonic plague during that era. So this would have been early 1600s. And he published a book in 1665 called Micrographia, where he had examinations. He was one of the first individuals to use the microscope and publish his work through the Royal Society journals. And he published information about the plague flea. So it appears as though they had some idea that the flea was spreading the disease at that point. And so he was involved in pretty much all the facets of the early scientific journal of the Royal Society.
At least that's the story as it appears, and we'll get into it in a bit. Some other evidence that suggests a whole other lead there that the Royal Society was investigating early on, maybe in the 1600s, or just before them, some of the related family groups and things, and what may have put them onto it, which was the Black Plague that had actually wiped out and destroyed none other than Tartary. And so, this looks like an actual planned genocide against Tartary to wipe them out, and that was how they they killed them off.
And I would like to say that that's around the same era that we see the massive witch burnings or, the witch trials of Europe. So we're known here in the United States by just the Salem Witch Trials. That's the most famous trial, but you can go back, the witch hunts of Europe go back to the 1400s, which would overlap with this same plague era.
Right. So now getting back to this. So, sorry. Now, let's get into the. Did we already cover the scientific method and scientism as a religion?
We talked about peer review, but they also developed scientific method. And like we mentioned before with the Puritans, they were the first real organized religion to embrace science, embrace heliocentrism, embrace this idea of this new study called science. They were calling it natural philosophy at the time, and it was based from right.
Now, of course, they're all citing each other in their own beliefs of this system that they all create, just like I expose in Spies in Academic Clothing. So it's this, excuse the pun, it's a circle jerk. And so, they're just citing each other back and forth in their beliefs regarding heliocentrism, regarding these different things. And then they promote these things out using the wealth of the royal crown, etc., to fund all of these different projects and to promote the ideals as the crown sees fit. And so this scientism is promoted by Harvard, aka the Puritans. And, so at this point, the Puritans and Harvard should really be considered, synonymous with one another. And so, at this point, we can really begin to implicate Harvard in this investigation, and Harvard really needs, 326 years Harvard's gotten away with this stuff. And, so a serious investigation needs to go on to investigate Harvard's role in all of this, and to, Harvard needs to, make a public apology to the families and everything that not to mention the Christians that have taken the blame for this nonsense for the last 326 years. So let's get into something called spectral evidence.
Okay, so in the very beginning of the Royal Society and Harvard, there were all these different facets of the new creation of science. And, some of the beginnings involved, of course, like astronomy, astrology, botany. They were the first to really look into archaeology, like the creation of that as a study. And heliocentrism was promoted. And spectral evidence was also promoted, which people might find bizarre, but it's the idea that someone who had made a compact or contract with the devil had the ability to be in several places at once, interact simultaneously, and could harass and cause ill to other people. So the idea of spectral evidence was the idea that this type of torment or affliction, as they called it, could be used in the puritanical court system to convict people.
Now, of course, we should point out that it was Harvard and those at Harvard, William Stoughton, Matthew Hopkins, the witchcraft general, etc., who really, and I believe wasn't Cotton Mathers behind this as well, but it was really them who promoted this nonsense, this cockamamie story of spectral evidence that they then used in their own court trials and hearings. And it's, I want to mention here that spectral evidence is very similar to the nonsense that we see today as quantum physics, and using basically math magic to create illusion and to pretend that reality doesn't exist, etc. So, it's a very similar sort of thing, and we see them employing this in the 1690s as a distraction. So, Let's get into this this book that you discovered by what was his name? Who wrote that?
Joseph Glanville.
Joseph Glanville. He writes a very important book. Let's get into that.
So during this time, there were a lot of authors, a lot of people from the Royal Society who were writing books about witchcraft, defining it, defining spectral evidence, defining the torture and interrogation techniques, and how they would go through and convict and execute people in the courts. And so there's the book Sedictimus Triumphatus, written in 1681 by Joseph Glanville, and it really promoted spectral evidence along with some other English witch finders who were using spectral evidence over in Europe. And then these books influenced, there were several books that came out, and they influenced Cotton Mather, and he started to write his own books on spectral evidence. One of them was Memorable Providences. So there were many books published by Royal Society writers promoting the idea of spectral evidence at that time.
Now, this Sedicimus Triumphatus influences none other than MI6 agent and infamous Satanist by the name of Aleister Crowley. Of course, Aleister Crowley is famous for helping kick off the 60s counterculture revolution for the British MI6 and CIA, known as Project MKUltra. He was behind a lot of that, which I've exposed extensively, and I've got him up there on the screen in the database. But so Crowley is one of the key people that's influenced by this stuff. But the reason why isn't because of what most people believe is witchcraft. It's because of the art of deception, or the lie, and we'll get into that more as we go. So, all right. So, what can you tell us about torture techniques, Holly?
So this part of like the Salem Witch Trials are pretty well known. A lot of people know about that when they talk about the Salem Witch Trials. So, you know, like if a woman, or usually it was a woman, a lot of men as well, people would be accused of witchcraft, and you know, you could either sink or swim. You know, if they threw you in the water and you sunk, then you were innocent, and if you floated, you were guilty. And they employed spectral evidence. So someone would say, okay, this person slapped me in my sleep, or, you know, they caused dizziness or fainting, and they would use torture to try to get a confession out of people. They had all these different ways that they could torture a witch, and this was promoted for centuries in Europe, and then it came into the United States, and the 1692 was kind of pushing the limits of the last of that type of spectral evidence being used.
Right. So, you know, so Harvard created this whole bullshit nonsense theory to cover their own butts, and essentially, you know, and we're going to go into this more, how they sort of, you know, it created all of this plausible deniability so that they could cover their rear ends to cover up these human experiments that they were doing. But let's get into some of the first victims of Harvard and Cotton Mather's human experiments. Let's talk about the Goodwin children.
So this started in 1688, which is several years before the official Salem Witch Trials, as we call it. So the official trial started in 1692, but in 1688, there were 3 children, the Goodwin children. They started to come down with bizarre symptoms, shaking, convulsions, and they were taken into the care of Cotton Mather for medical examination. So,
shocker.
Yeah, so he took in the kids, examined them, and then he was able to write this, you know, he wrote Memorable Providences, and he was able to describe the Goodwin's children's afflictions, and then that became the basis for the Salem Witch Trials a few years later.
All right, so let's get into the actual trials now. Let's talk about how many people die, how many deaths, how many executions, all that good stuff.
So it was the largest witch conviction and execution in American history. There had been, of course, in Europe, hundreds of thousands. We don't even know how many people were murdered in a similar way. But when everything was said and done, there were 25 deaths during this short time period, and 25 deaths. So 19 people were executed. One man was crushed to death because he would not admit. So it was one of the torture techniques to lay him down and pile him up with stones. And he refused to admit that he was a witch, and they just kept putting stones on him, and he got crushed. And then 5 people died in prison as well in Salem. So when all was said and done, 25 people died. There were a lot of people that were accused. A lot of them were women, middle-aged women, landowning women, and
this is one of the limited hangouts that they've actually used as an excuse of why the Salem Witch Trials happened. It was because it was a land grab. So this is one of the nonsense smoke screens that has been fed to the public.
Yeah, they're like, oh, it could have been a land grab because some of the women, were widows, land owning. It doesn't explain the whole situation, obviously. And it seemed that only there was the Governor Phipps, who was governor of Massachusetts at the time. And only when the accusations started to move their way up to some more high-level people in the puritanical sphere that the governor shut it down. So it went on for a while. And of course, the judge at the time in Salem allowed the use of spectral evidence in his courts, which was very contested by other judges in the area. So there seemed to be this sort of collusion where everyone was allowing spectral evidence to run.
It's like, arguing that, quantum physics is real and there's 13 realities, so there could be this thing that happened on another dimension, and therefore that's what took place. I mean, that's the kind of nonsense argument that they're feeding. So what we find is that just as I exposed with MKUltra and in Spies in Academic Clothing, we have a total control of the entire dialectic with Cotton Mather involved, and all of them from each different direction are Royal Society. So the Royal Society needs to be investigated and needs to be brought to to justice for their crimes against humanity, against this, for all of this. And, spreading this lie against the Christians for 326 years, which was, as we'll get into more, that was the reason for the cover story, and that was part of the plausible deniability, was to blame the Christians for this whole thing. So now, as an example of how... And this was a Professor Olson that published this on his website. He talks about this guy. And on October 8, 1692, Thomas Brattle, a merchant, mathematician, astronomer, and fellow of the Royal Society, wrote an eloquent letter quoted above criticizing the witchcraft trials and convictions of the members of the General Court. Now, mind you, the members of the court and the convictions, everything is being run by other members of the Royal Society. They're all in on it. They're all playing the dialectic from a different angle. And, so here, I'll just show this quote on screen here. But this letter increased Mather's cases of, and that's the president of Harvard right there. Cases of conscience apparently had a great impact on Governor Phipps, who on October 12 prohibited further imprisonments for witchcraft. On October 26, the General Court dismissed the court of Oyer and Terminer, and on October 29, the governor formally dissolved it. On November 25, 1692, the General Court created the Superior Court of judicature to try the remaining witchcraft cases, but spectral evidence was not allowed. Okay, so again, spectral evidence was created by the Royal Society people. Okay, so now it's the Royal Society talking about the Royal Society and not allowing Royal Society nonsense into a Royal Society thing. So they're playing up different angles of the dialectic to cover their own asses for their own plausible deniability. And so this time, only 3 of the 56 defendants were condemned, and Phipps pardoned them with 5 others awaiting execution. In May 1693, Phipps pardoned all of those who were still in prison on witchcraft charges. They were free provided they could pay their jail bills. So, you lock them up in prison for a while and then, and then charge them the bill for locking them up for this whole nonsense that they did not create. So now let's talk about this slave girl.
Okay, so I found a strange connection when I was researching the history of the Salem trials and the Puritans. And it seems that a lot of this story seems to tie back to the colony of Barbados. So the official narrative says that Tituba was the name of the slave that was owned by John Paris. He was he went to Harvard, and he was one of the richest largest plantation owners in Barbados. And his 2 daughters were some of the first girls to have fallen under these afflictions. So Tituba was blamed. She was accused of using her voodoo to start up the whole witchcraft hysteria, and she was put into prison. She was never executed, but it seemed like there's this overarching theme connecting Puritanism to Barbados. It seemed that the Puritans simultaneously were going to Massachusetts and Barbados at the same time. And also under Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, he allowed Judaism into England again. And the Jews of England were going to Barbados with the Puritans, and Barbados became the sugarcane capital of the world. They promoted slavery. That's how the slave route went to the United States, was through Barbados, and also the rum trade that was starting up. So,
which was used for slave trade.
Exactly. And the Royal Society, since Barbados is still part of, it's an English colony still technically, the Royal Society is all down there as well. So there's like a strange connection between all of Barbados and Massachusetts at this time.
And so there was also, we believe, a connection that they had discovered sugar and other things to lower the immune system so that they could cause disease and everything. And people, you want to talk about that as well?
Well, I mean, as we all know, sugar is highly addictive. It's an addictive substance, and it was extremely profitable at that time to be using African slaves to basically clear the entire island of Barbados, establish these massive plantations, very wealthy, and in getting involved with the slave trade and promoting sugar during this time in Europe and in the United States, whether it was, cane sugar or refined sugar that they developed, or rum. The rum trade was huge there as well.
All right. So
I just want to point one more thing too. Later on, as we'll get into the story of Massachusetts and the plagues, it appears that the plague, smallpox plagues, where they said came from Barbados at that time as well.
All right. And, where the Royal Society had labs and things doing their crap, probably putting it in stuff. So let's see. Let's get into early forms of propaganda. So it turns out that Cotton Mather was a pamphleteer, which it was an early form of propaganda. So what we found now, as I've exposed with Harvard, can't go too far from Harvard, with Tim Leary and the Harvard Social Relations Department under Henry A. Murray. This is still is today, as far as I know, a major CIA hub there at Harvard, and that that they run all of these bullshit programs out of to mess with the people, and a lot of the people from the Harvard social relations department end up at the Esalen Institute up in Big Sur, Northern California, which is a major CIA front there as well, where they promote all of this New Age nonsense, and now they promote Wicca and witchcraft and all of this kind of stuff there as well. Interestingly, right? So Harvard is really the hub of these types of propaganda happening. But so Cotton Mather, he was basically like one of the first, as far as we know so far, he could have been like the first propagandist in the U.S., right? So what was Cotton Mather propagandizing?
So he was a prolific writer, and he was a publisher in the Royal Society journals, and he was constantly quoting other people in the Royal Society journals, and he was promoting...
in that circle jerk again,
Exactly. So he was involved with medical experiments, horticultural experiments, so like botany, and scientific observations, and he became very interested in what he claims to have discovered in Royal Society journals about inoculation. And so there's some conflicting timelines about when he actually got this information about early inoculation. There's a story that, it came over from Constantinople, and he was quoting this. It's an article by Timonius, who claimed to have observed inoculation in Constantinople. And Mather was quoting this as part of his idea to promote inoculation in the United States. He
probably, it was probably somebody else on the other end, or they just made up the citation in Constantinople to refer to it so that they could then implement it, that kind of nonsense like they always do. All right, so Cotton Mather, he also has some other connections as well. He was friends with a guy by the name of, and I'm going to bring this up in the database. So hold on a second, and we have this ugly creep Satan on the screen here. Let's see. So Cotton Mather, so he was friends with this guy, Elihu Yale. Now, Elihu Yale, in 1701, he goes off and he creates this school, you may have heard of it, called Yale University, Yale College. And, of course, Yale University, that's where we get the order of none other than Skull and Bones. And, of course, it's one more of the Ivy League schools where they promote all of these same tactics and everything. Down here we got, who is that down there, like George Bush and all these Satanists and their order of trickery and sophistry. But so he... Cotton Mather actually told Elihu Yale to go and found Yale University, and so that's actually the foundation story of Yale as well, and the same little nexus of Royal Society people.
Yep, he was one of the early funders of Yale. And then we can just, extrapolate that to all the other Ivy League schools who, control peer review and this sort of process even to this day.
All right. So now Cotton Mather's writes to the Royal Society in 1716. Let's talk about that.
So Cotton Mather starts a series of letters to the Royal Society saying that in 1716, if a smallpox plague hits Boston, he is going to launch a campaign to experiment and start inoculating people in Boston. And so he quotes Timonius and this idea of the inoculations going on in Constantinople. And he also claims that he had heard from his slave, Onesimus, that he had been inoculated in Africa. So he said, well, my slave, which was highly contentious, a lot of other people were not didn't believe that that was like a valid sort of research point for him to be quoting his own slave, because the Puritans believed in slavery and Mather owned several slaves. And he claimed that Onesimus said, he had a smallpox like scab pustule put in his arm in Africa. So therefore, Cotton Mather was writing to the Royal Society and said, if something like this happens, it would be highly profitable. People would pay a lot of money for inoculation. So we should try to do some testing next time that a plague breaks out in Boston.
All right. And so in 1721, what happens?
So the first, it's claimed official narrative says that a blackjack, which was an African sailor working for the British, he arrived on the HMS Seahorse in 1721, which is a boat that docked off in Boston. And the official narrative says that this individual, who had just come back from Barbados, had spread the smallpox plague in Boston. And when this plague started to hit Boston, Mather was ready to roll out his campaign, and he published a several dozen page pamphlet with a doctor as on the title, which we find out is basically word for word what Mather said a few years before, what he was going to do, and pointing out, referencing Timonius, referencing Onesimus, the slave, basically word for word, as scholars admit, that it was Cotton Mather's paper, pamphleteer, that he put out, and he used a physician and to promote this as official medical record, and they started their campaign testing on people.
Now, these idiots eventually, these Harvard-trained idiots eventually start a riot, or riots, mini riots, so Cotton Mather's house in 1921 is bombed, and a riot ensues because of his inoculation things, and apparently probably getting a lot of people sick and whatnot. And mind you, he's secretly doing these experiments, 20 years earlier in Salem, and then later on he's rolling this stuff out, acting like it's all new research and everything, and he hasn't been doing the stuff in the background all along. So his house gets bombed, and then additional riots happen in 1730. The next Harvard president, Edward Holyoke, causes a riot from his inoculation schemes as well.
So this is a little known history about, if you look up vaccination or inoculation, we don't really hear about this idea that in Massachusetts it was experimented. These campaigns, launched by Harvard, inoculating people, testing on people, were very contentious. People were very upset about people being infected. They thought it would continue to spread the disease. And so, yes, there was a riot, and someone threw a bomb, which did not go off. It went into Cotton Mather's house. And after that bomb was thrown into his house, he started to step away from the inoculation campaign that he launched, even though it was relaunched by Harvard several times once you start to look into this history.
All right, so now comes in this important term, mass hysteria. And, this whole program, I want to point out, really mirrors what I had discovered when doing research at Princeton regarding the War of the Worlds project, and, that I exposed with Dr. Hans Utter, which is this episode here. And, so it's very important that people watch this War of the Worlds episode, because it really just breaks down and explains, how Harvard was using mass hysteria and everything, or how Princeton, was using mass hysteria to mislead people and to study them for control, as a prototype of panic and whatnot. So this is basically what we see them. In fact, what we're realizing is that the War of the Worlds, Princeton scandal put on by the OSS, etc., wasn't the first prototype of panic that Hans and I thought it was. That it was actually, 240, 250 years earlier with the Salem Witch Trials, at least that we know now, and who knows how much further back we can go, right? But so now what we're seeing is a repeated pattern. That was weird. I pronounced that weird. And how they are, doing these types of operations. So, Salem becomes an earlier prototype of these operations. And and then that rolls on later on throughout history, and Salem actually becomes, as we'll show, has key influence in the CIA's MKUltra program.
Yeah, so a lot of people think of the Salem Witch Trials or as like this one incident, just some women who went crazy. They call it spontaneous mass hysteria, or they'll say Puritanism caused it. But once you start to look into Cotton Mather, who seemed to have orchestrated the whole thing, making sure that the courts use spectral evidence, observing and taking in the afflicted girls, like he basically had like the puppet strings over the whole thing. And then you see it directly ties into his very next campaign, which is the Harvard's early inoculation program. So these seemingly two disconnected events start to really tie together, and that started to tie in with your paper, Spies in Academic Clothing, talking about these other campaigns launched by Harvard, such as like the Psychedelic Research Project. I started to see a connection between all of this.
And so, for the audience, my paper here, Spies in Academic Clothing, it is a long paper, and it's worth every bit of it for you to read it and understand how they run these operations. But, it's really key to understanding how these people at these so-called Ivy League schools, how they run their scams and their so-called academia. All right, so let's get into Ergot. This is going to be fun. Let's get into Ergot as a limited hangout.
So this is actually where I made the connection that Harvard seemed to be connected to the Salem Witch Trials. So when I was reading your article, you were talking about Ergot in Spies in Academic Clothing, and ergotism, and you talk about ergometrine later on, and Pont Saint Esprit. And so read the article if you haven't read the article, so you know what I'm talking about. But I had heard, one of the common descriptions of what happened with the Salem Witch Trials, a more recent explanation, the classic explanation is that it was spontaneous mass hysteria by some oppressed women in puritanical society, and that's still the most common idea. But in the 1970s and 1976, ergot and ergotism, which is ergot poisoning, was proposed as a possible explanation for why the girls were afflicted. So, the convulsions, the extreme sickness, hallucinations, etc., covers some of the symptoms, but not all. And also we have to question, why is it just those girls and not, if it infected, ergot is a fungus that infects rye, and rye was commonly consumed in Salem. And so the disease, right.
They would have known. They would have known about it, but
right.
Yeah. So, and for those who don't know, ergot is what LSD is made from. So this was stuck in the storyline as a limited hangout, as as these complicit and incompetent so-called scholars try to control the historical narrative throughout history. So now this mass hysteria ploy connects over to another program that I also exposed, which which was Pont Saint-Esprit, this French village that they had basically dosed the entire town and caused hundreds of people to go crazy. 7 people died. Albert Hoffman, who was under the employ of the CIA as well as French intelligence, he's there in the background monitoring and studying this whole thing. This all took place in 1951 in France. And so, in my opinion, it probably was not LSD tests. What my suspicion is that it was ergometrine. Now, Albert Hoffman worked, of course, for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, who worked, which was under the employ of the CIA, and with MK Ultra and all of this stuff. But Albert Hoffman's boss, interestingly enough, this all starts tying back together because Albert Hoffman's boss at Sandoz was a guy by the name of Arthur Stoll. Now, I've long said that Albert Hoffman did not invent LSD, that it was his boss, Arthur Stoll, who invented it probably between 1918 and 1923, I suspect 1918. Arthur Stoll also invented ergometrine, which has the exact same symptoms as St. Anthony's fire, which is ergotism. Now, so Arthur Stoll is doing these experiments, and I suspect that in reality, Arthur Stoll invented LSD, and they passed the invention of LSD over to Albert Hoffman in 1938, and then the nonsense Bicycle Day story in 1943 to cover up human experiments that they had been doing from 1918 to 1938 at minimum. And so now what we're going to find is that excuse me, somebody's distracted me. So what we're going to find is that at Arthur Stoll at Harvard, not at Harvard, Arthur Stoll, Albert Hoffman's boss, was a member of none other than the Royal Society. Now, in 1965, another CIA agent working with a guy by the name of Dr. Andrea Puharich, they were all under the employ of the CIA and MK Ultra, working with Aldous Huxley and everybody in that whole thing. John G. Fuller goes over to France in 1965 and does a follow-up study, the day of St. Anthony's fire, and he brings in all of this UFO mass hysteria and stuff as he's coming in to create more hysteria on the poor French people that the CIA already dosed and already did all of this stuff. I mean, talk about, these, the 6 psychopaths at the CIA, just absolutely disgusting. So, Arthur Stoll is a member of the Royal Society. Now, it gets better. So, in 1933, in an article that I had co-written called Manufacturing the Deadhead, I discussed this guy, Leo Perutz. Now, let's pull up Perutz. Now, Leo Perutz wrote a book called The Mystery of St. Peter's Snow, which was a novel written in 1933, wherein he predicts the isolation of a hallucinogenic drug from an ergot-type fungus 10 years before they discover the hallucinogenic properties of ergot-derived alkaloid LSD. So here is this guy writing this novel 10 years apparently. So it's officially discovered in 1943 with the nonsense Bicycle Day story that's when LSD was invented. But, so even if we go by 1938 is the official story that Albert Hoffman discovered it. Well, here's Leo Perutz writing the identical story in his book, St. Peter's Snow, but he doesn't call it LSD. He says, it's derived from a fungus of wheat and, all of this nonsense. So as it turns out, I started investigating Leo Perutz and his family, and it turns out that Leo Perutz was a family member to a guy by the name of Max Perutz, who is a member of the Royal Society. So, it's a very tight loop that goes right back to that, and we can see, the same connection. So now this limited hangout later on that's promoted regarding LSD is interesting because both Ergot and the plague and these vaccines and all are both being promoted by the Royal Society. They're both different, streams that overlap, and the symptoms overlap. It's like they use one and the other to cover up, as a cover up for their human experiments and stuff like that. That's, sort of a guess I have at what they're doing there. But, so they have this whole cover up going on there between the two, but the Royal Society is doing both the Ergot research as well as the plague research, the Black Plague research, the smallpox, and all of that stuff.
Keep going. You got this.
Oh, well, so why don't you want to talk about what you found on the Black Plague, etc.?
Let me think. Yeah, so I kind of touched on it before with Robert Hooke. It appears that the very founding of the Royal Society ties in with a lot of Black Plague researchers, and there seems to be also a connection between the observations of the ergot fungus, whether it got into the food supply, or we found evidence that it was used as chemical war put into the water supply, and it seemed to weaken populations. So people get very sick, even to the point of their limbs would fall off. It could be a really terrible disease that would start to affect people. And this would wear populations down. And this was all going on at the same time that this Black Plague was going through Europe. And we know that it's a massive number of Europeans died from this plague, the pustules. And so there seems to be this connection between people researching these diseases along with Ergot at the same time. And the Royal Society is once again tied in with that.
All right, so let's get into the Royal Society promoting the witchcraft that they then use as a shield to protect Harvard.
Okay.
Do you want to...
Okay, so it appears as we start to look into the Salem Witch Trials that Harvard, through the Royal Society, was promoting this idea of witchcraft as a scientific method. It was used in the courts, which was concerning to a lot of people in North America, in Massachusetts, in Salem, that one judge was using spectral evidence in court. And that's how all those people were convicted. And it appears to tie that Harvard and the Royal Society were promoting this idea of spectral evidence along with other modes of science as their way to create mass hysteria.
Right. So, so they promote this idea, and, they use it as a shield to protect Harvard, just as they did with Leary's getting fired from Harvard. And then he goes on to, and you have this whole thing in the Harvard Crimson published, which is the Harvard newspaper, published by Dr. Andrew Weil, the so-called, hippie nutrition guru guy. And, so this is all staged, and they're all working behind the scenes in the Harvard, social relations department, staging this all so that Leary can go out and promote this crap. Now, so it gave the illusion that Leary's spiritual message was being, and I'm, there a couple of points are out of order here, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this quote. So now this is a quote that I wrote in Spies in Academic Clothing. It says, one thing that is difficult to understand is the fable regarding Tim Leary's getting fired from Harvard in 1963 and the exposure by Dr. Andrew Weil. It appears from the evidence that Weil's exposure was just an old trick using the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Without Leary having been fired from Harvard, he'd never have been able to create the appearance of the hippie guru he'd later use to promote psychedelics to the youth for the CIA and Huxley and Osmond. Weil's so-called exposure and Leary's subsequent firing, along with Dr. Richard Alpert, or so-called Ramdas, created the illusion, in my opinion, caveat, that Harvard et al. Were trying to suppress, quote-unquote, Leary's spiritual message. This gave Leary and the CIA the psychological advantage they'd need to use against the public, and after all, Leary and the others were nearly all out of the Harvard Social Relations Department under well-known MK Ultra conspirator Dr. Henry A. Murray, who headed the department. So, so they're running this scandal, and they create this whole, this whole thing at Harvard for this. Now, let's, Leary's spiritual message is being suppressed, right? And so then Leary can crank out his spiritual message to the hippie children of peace, love, and CIA, LSD, and mushrooms and all of that stuff for MK Ultra and hypersuggestion. Now, something else was suppressed as far as the public was concerned. It was, what was it? Witchcraft. So, okay. So the Salem Witch Trials give the appearance that the Puritans, they're suppressing the spiritual message of the witches, right? And so we have the exact same ploy. The only difference is that Leary is, pretending to be the witch himself, whereas, Cotton Mather was not, essentially, right?
Yeah, so they invented this whole idea of witchcraft and spectral evidence and creating this mass hysteria, and then they can also simultaneously be promoting enlightenment and enlightenment science. And so it's like this idea of plausible deniability, because Mather, after the witchcraft trials went on and after his failed inoculation campaign, he was denied the presidency of Harvard. As his father had been president of Harvard, it was assumed that he would take over. But it seems that Harvard started to distance themselves from this inoculation campaign, which they completely created through the Royal Society journals. You can read the primary documents, and some people in the chat are like, where are you getting this information? Well, I've been reading like primary documents, like a lot of his letters, and going through what was going on at the time to try to create this timeline. And it appears that they were able to create this idea of witchcraft and magic and promote it, and also at the same time be promoting this enlightenment science and undermining basically Christianity as they're going through by offering up this solution of enlightenment.
Correct. So they created and promoted the witchcraft, and then so they, the Puritans suppress it, quote unquote, and so this causes a big interest in it, and so today the Royal Society publishes nonsense articles like this one here on screen. The Royal Society and the Decline of Magic. Now, so this is just, complete nonsense, because today, because of groups like the Royal Society and the Esalen Institute and the CIA, etc., today we see the belief in magic and mysticism and all of this stuff more rampant than it ever was. But, so in Massachusetts, they have, well, let's talk about Massachusetts and the Salem Museum, etc.
So if you go to Salem, it's basically Salem, Massachusetts is basically the witchcraft capital of the world. If you're in downtown Salem, it's all cobblestones, and every other store is like a tarot store, or get your palm read, or the Salem Witchcraft Museum it shows like the wax, it's like wax sculptures of all the people who are accused. And then at the very end, they're promoting modern Wicca. And of course, people also know that the Church of Satan, the headquarters, is in Salem, Massachusetts. So this article that you pulled up, the Royal Society and the Decline of Magic, which is from the Royal Society Publishing, they're saying it's paradoxically influential, that it seems that the Royal Society simultaneously promoted magic and witchcraft, and then also they're denying that they were involved and said, oh no, we've been promoting enlightenment all along.
Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. All right, so getting back into this, so let's see, where's my notes here? So what we're going to get into next is, and this is really important for people to understand, there was, in fact, a massive spell that was cast. And this whole thing was, in fact, a spell. And, so this is going to be hard for a lot of people to grasp, but what people need to understand is that for 326 years, an entire PR campaign, an attack was launched on the Christians falsely, and this entire spell has gone on falsely for 326 years, but it is a spell. It was an illusion to get people into a dream state or a state of, believing lies for hundreds of years and blaming Christianity for so-called suppressing this stuff when this whole thing is a charade. But the entire event is actually an inversion. So they're going around and they're accusing witches and they're blaming the Christians and pretending that witchcraft doesn't exist and all of this stuff. But meanwhile, it is the witches in the whole story were the Puritans and the Harvard faculty and the Royal Society. And they are the ones who cast this spell of inversion. And then they control the dialogue, from several different directions for over 3 centuries. And so this is all a form of Kabbalistic black magic. And the spell was cast against the Christians and has survived intact up until this moment right now. And, this spell is undone. And, so what I want to discuss as well is that, the woodcuts before and after the trials and everything of Salem and everything, when we get into the woodcuts of this whole thing, we can see, and, and I need to get this together in an article where they're actually dated now. What we actually saw was more simpleton-style woodcuttings being brought about a century, 2 centuries after the fact to make the people of Salem look like simpletons and morons and all of this stuff. And but when you go back, this type of thing, but when you go back earlier into these, you see much more complicated woodcutting. So it's like, the stuff that they promoted afterwards looks like a 3-year-old drew it, whereas this earlier stuff from the 15th century and earlier 1600s is much more detailed and intricate. And so, and here's one of the witches' homes from Salem. But, so these wood cuttings were altered. I think they were altered after the fact to control, the appearance and of the people of Salem and of the white settlers of the era, of the Christians. They were made to look like simpleton Christians and all of this, dotards, and they did this horrible thing. So this was all part of the magic that was a part of the spell that was created by Harvard and the Royal Society and the Puritan, lack of a better word, the Puritan witches. So let's get now into a very important topic that you discovered Holly, and that is how this all connects into separation of church and state.
Okay, so I thought the idea with promoting scientism and the Royal Society's focus on heliocentrism, we can trace it back to Copernicus and Galileo over in Europe, and then they brought it into the modern Enlightenment era, as we call it. So Isaac Newton was intimately involved with the Royal Society. He was a Royal Society member. And Benjamin Franklin was a Royal Society member. And one of the most famous experiments published by the Royal Society was his, electricity kite experiment. And Ben Franklin had spoken out against spectral evidence a few decades later, and distanced himself and distanced the Royal Society from the idea of spectral evidence, and said, we're a new modern society. We don't need Puritanism. We don't need Christianity. We need the separation of church and state. So the founding fathers were promoting this. They were all part of the Enlightenment era, which we all know, we've been taught about. And it was the fact was to, to go out on a limb, like undermine natural law and create the modern U.S. system and form the colonies from this idea of rising up out of the puritanical Christianity, which dominated early colonial life, and going into the American colonies, into the United States, with the separation of church and state and modern science.
So now there was a quote that we have up there in the notes. A tragic event in Salem in 1692 clearly illustrate why alleged supernatural entities or forces are no longer admissible. So, first the Royal Society creates the bullshit theory, and then, Ben Franklin and all of them distance themselves from it, but they use it, they create this whole mess, and then, all of it is surrounding Harvard, the Royal Society, and the Puritans, so they're playing all sides of this thing. And let's see, in legal proceedings as evidence of guilt or innocence of the accused, the Enlightenment, beginning in the 1680s, contributed to the end of witch hunts. So they create the bullshit and then cause the witch hunts and then create the Enlightenment and then say that the Enlightenment is the end of the witch hunts that they themselves created at the Royal Society and at Harvard. So, this is the type of, psychological warfare and manipulation that these psychopaths at Harvard and at the Royal Society have committed. So, and then let's see, the end of witch hunts throughout Europe and America by pointing out that there was no empirical evidence that alleged witches caused real harm by emphasizing the use of torture to force confessions was inhumane. So it was about torture part, I'm sure they were studying that, but we can see that the real purpose of this was to create the Enlightenment, to move America away from Christianity. So we didn't need truth and logos anymore. We have to get into mysticism and into Royal Society scientism and into, their peer review thought control system, which of course, later on in the 1800s, Thomas Henry Huxley would take the head of the Royal Society, and more recently, Julian Huxley, etc. And of course, the Huxleys are involved in all levels of MK Ultra and social Darwinism and, crimes against humanity that you can imagine, So, so they cause the witch hunts, and then they turn and claim that it's the cause of the witch hunts and the end of the witch hunts, So this is all of this nonsense that they are playing from all different sides as the Royal Society controls the dialectic of the whole thing. Now, let's see. So I've already talked about, Leary. So, now here, let's go back to Leary for a minute, because Leary, it's claimed, he went rogue and, he got out of the CIA's control, and he was just a scholar gone bad. And, this is part of the official, nonsense narrative of plausible deniability that Harvard has created so that they don't get their asses sued for the 60s counterculture revolution and, the CIA's MK Ultra program running out of their social relations department, right? So, so they claim that Leary went rogue, and then they create the air that Leary was fired in the Harvard Crimson with the nonsense article by Andrew Weil and all of this stuff. But what they also did, though, was what did Harvard claim about Mather, Cotton Mather?
So after the inoculation trials, soon after the Salem Witch Trials, so early 1700s, people were already highly critical of what happened in Massachusetts. They had entered into the Enlightenment era, so witchcraft and the idea of spectral evidence was not being used in the 1700s. But when Mather rolled out his inoculation campaign, he was blamed for that whole event, and he subsequently was not part of Harvard anymore, which allowed Harvard the plausible deniability of these failed inoculation campaigns, the testing that they continued to do into the mid 1700s. And if you look at books about the Salem Witch Trials, every year, there's dozens of books that come out. Every few years there's like another book that comes out talking about the Salem Witch Trials. They always sell well. People love the topic. I mean, Salem's basically like a Disneyland. If you go down there, it's they've really promoted this idea that maybe there were witches there, when in the whole time it appears that Harvard and the Royal Society created this whole thing.
Right. Now, I also want to point out that in this Disneyland thing there, when you realize that it's all about the art of deception, and it also explains, why the Church of Satan would use Salem as as their location to host this thing, because they would know that this was all a massive deception against the American public, and especially against Christians. So they knew that that was a key place. So that's, I think, why they put their location there. Now, so Leary's spiritual message was being suppressed. The witch's spiritual message was being suppressed. So now we can see this agenda to sell this enlightenment and this, just like we see out of the Esalen Institute and all of this New Age stuff, like the Aquarian conspiracy and all of that I've exposed for years on the show, that is the whole of the psychedelic revolution and CIA MK Ultra program at all. But so the twist is that Mather wasn't the witch, but he promoted witchcraft behind the scenes, whereas Leary became the witch himself. And so, for those who think that Leary was some great genius or something over there at Harvard and the CIA, the only twist of brilliance that he added to this pathetic ploy was that he assumed the witch's role, as opposed to Cotton Mather didn't. So, I mean, if you guys want to think that Leary was smart or whatever, that's the extent of his brilliance right there. So, so this is all a great big double rap lie that they've done against Christianity, and that the Puritan Jews and Harvard and Royal Society committed against the Christian community for the last 326 years. And in August 25, 1706, Ann Putnam, and I wonder if that's the famous wealthy Putnam family, publicly apologized in Salem Village Church for causing the deaths of innocent people, which she said was due to a great delusion of Satan. Okay, that's not exactly true, and they're creating, again, they're misleading the public about what really took place. Eventually, the colony admitted that the trials were a mistake and compensated the families for those convicted. So they create this whole thing. They lie, they attack the Christians, get blamed for this whole thing, and then they admit it's a mistake and they pay it off. So that, mind you, the Christians are the ones who have taken the blame for this entire spell for the last for however long, even from 1706. The Christians took the blame for the entire thing. And then let's see, and then Massachusetts did not formally apologize for it until 1957, which was ironically the same year that Gordon Wasson published his, Seeking the Magic Mushroom in Life magazine, and on May 13, which was the real kickoff for the MKUltra program. So, well, what do you think of that?
So, good job there.
So we're just about done here, folks. We're just about to wrap it up here.
Well, I think people need to take a look at the idea of Harvard and the Salem Witch Trials and the Inoculation campaign, which Massachusetts and Harvard, I'm pretty sure, never compensated all the victims of the inoculation campaigns in the early 1700s. People were tested on for a long time by Harvard during, for inoculations. So I think the point here is that people need to start looking for academic cells. So your book, your article, Spies in Academic Clothing, connected these pictures of seemingly disconnected people and events that happen throughout history and connected to academia. But my call to the audience is to start to look for these academic cells, and not just in Harvard. Like Harvard's our focus here with the Salem Witch Trials, but you just look at Yale or look at any other college.
You can pick any subject. I bet you could probably pick like boll weevils or something like that and research that, and you'd probably find a damn academic cell running the same scam behind it. But one thing that we need to point out is that it's either the incompetence or the complicity of these so-called, modern scholars and academic cells. 326 years this nonsense has gone on. Nobody's told the truth. I heard maybe one other person several months ago possibly investigating it. I don't know what the results of their investigations were. You and I put this together, and you've done a fantastic job digging up all of the research. I got to hand it to you, Holly. You are the most brilliant woman I've ever researched with, and that I've ever met on any of this stuff. It's just absolutely fantastic what you've uncovered here, and your ability to research is amazing. So I have to give you credit and kudos to all that you've found here. And no doubt that people will find this repeating pattern that I lay out in Spies in Academic Clothing, elsewhere, and then we can get in and really begin to tear the intelligence community apart, and how they've run these scandals for centuries, and we really need to make them just completely impotent. So this is one of the key ways that we can do that. So now the Christians are officially exonerated from the Salem Witch Trials for here on out, and investigations into Harvard and the Royal Society and the Puritans, I think, can now be made in confidence. And yes, it's true, the witches really existed. They were the Puritans who worked for Harvard and the Royal Society and sold you the lie for over 300 years. And so now, one of the greatest magic spells that has ever been committed in all history, cast against the Christians by the Royal Society, Harvard faculty, and the Puritans 326 years ago, is now broken.
Woo!
Woo! So there you go, folks. That's it. That is a wrap. And did you have anything that you wanted to add to this, Holly?
I hope you subscribe to my channel. I usually don't talk about these subjects as much. I talk about alternative politics and try to put out videos every day on my YouTube channel. So if you want to subscribe, that would be really cool, because my channel is pretty small.
And how do people send you donations? Because you do your work on donations just like I do, and so it's really important for people to support your work as well. How do they support you? So
if people go to my YouTube channel, I've got a PayPal, Patreon, Maker support buttons all on there, and
sounds like what I need to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I've got some of my viewers in the chat and some of my awesome supporters. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, so much. Thanks, everyone who donated during the show tonight. I appreciate it. So we had about $150 worth of donations. It's so much appreciated. And can always use all the support we can get. And anyway, thanks so much, everyone. Good night. See you next week. Robert Rowe will be back next week. We've got a great show lined up for that. And boy, I'm not even going to give you a hint on it because you won't even get it. So anyway, take care, and until next time.